You had 8 years with me, Claire, and what exactly did you contribute? Nothing. You are nothing, Daniel. Whitmore threw the divorce papers across the table, grabbed her hand, and forced the pen into her fingers. Sign it right now, we're done here, he laughed while she signed. Laughed like a man who had just won the greatest victory of his life. He had no idea he was signing away his own destruction. Because the trembling woman sitting across from him, the woman he just called nothing, was the secret owner of the empire he had spent his entire career trying to conquer. If this story speaks to you, subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, and stay with us until the very end. You will not regret it. Daniel Whitmore woke up that Tuesday morning feeling like the world owed him something. He lay in the oversized bed of his Manhattan apartment, 36th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the city that most people only ever saw in photographs, and he stared at the ceiling with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally figured out the game of life. He was 36 years old, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development at Apex Meridian Corporation. One of the youngest executives in the company's 60-year history. His name appeared in 3 separate industry publications that year alone. His bonus had cleared 7 figures. His future, as far as Daniel could see, was an unbroken highway leading straight to the top. And today was the day he was going to remove the last obstacle standing between him and everything he believed he deserved. He rolled out of bed, buttoned his shirt in the mirror, studied his own reflection for a long moment, and said quietly to himself, "Today's the day." He smiled, not a warm smile, the kind of smile a man makes when he's been planning something for a long time, and the plan is finally arriving. He picked up his phone and called his attorney, Richard. "We still on for 11, everything's ready, Daniel. The settlement terms are exactly where you wanted them." "Good," Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, "she won't fight it." "She never fights anything." He said that last sentence the way someone says it, when they've confused kindness with weakness for so long that they've forgotten there's a difference. Claire Reynolds was already awake by the time Daniel was fixing his tie. She had been awake since 5:30, not because she couldn't sleep, but because sleeping had started to feel pointless. The bed that used to feel like safety had started feeling like something she was enduring rather than resting in. She sat at the small table near the kitchen window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and she stared at nothing in particular. She already knew what today was. Daniel had told her 3 days earlier, in the same casual tone he used when he told her the dry cleaning was ready or that he would be home late from work. "I've had the papers drawn up. We'll meet Tuesday at 11 with the attorneys." 3 days. That's how much warning she had been given after 8 years of marriage. She wrapped both hands around the cold cup and breathed slowly. She did not call her family. She did not call her financial advisors. She did not call the team of lawyers who had been managing the Reynolds estate since her parents died. She sat in silence and thought about the man she had married, and whether any version of him had ever actually existed, or whether she had simply fallen in love with the version she believed he could become. That was the thing about Claire that almost no one understood. She was not naive, she never had been, she was hopeful. And she had learned at a very painful cost that those two things look identical from the outsides but are completely different on the inside. She poured the cold coffee down the drain, rinsed the cup carefully, set it back on the shelf, and went to get dressed. The law offices of Harmon, Webb and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a building on Park Avenue that communicated power without saying a word about it. Dark wood, quiet carpets, people who spoke in measured tones and never raised their voices. Daniel arrived 7 minutes early. He walked in like he owned the building. He greeted Richard Harmon with a handshake and a grin and settled into the leather chair across from the empty seat where Claire would sit, and he crossed one leg over the other and checked his watch. "She'll probably be late," he said. She wasn't. Claire arrived at exactly 11 o'clock. She wore a plain gray dress and low heels. Her hair was pulled back simply. She carried a small purse and nothing else, no attorneys flanking her, no documents of her own, no entourage. Just Claire. She sat down across from Daniel and placed her hands together on the table and looked at him. Not with anger, not with pain, with something that Daniel would later spend months trying to identify, and the closest he ever came was this. She looked at him the way a doctor looks at a patient who has been ignoring a serious diagnosis for years. Not angry, just quietly, profoundly certain of something the patient hasn't figured out yet. Daniel didn't notice. He was already talking. "Claire, I want you to know I'm being generous here." He opened the folder in front of him. "The apartment in Connecticut goes to you. We're offering a settlement that covers 18 months of living expenses based on your current lifestyle. Richard's team has made sure everything is fair." He said the word fair the way people say it when they mean convenient for themselves. Claire said nothing. She looked at the papers. Daniel continued. He couldn't help it. Silence made him uncomfortable, and when he was uncomfortable, he filled the space with his own voice. "Look, I know this isn't easy. But honestly, Claire, we've been going in different directions for years. You want a simple life, I get that. But I need someone who can keep up with where I'm going. You deserve someone who's happy with what you want. I deserve someone who matches my ambition. This is the right decision for both of us." He actually used the phrase "for both of us," like leaving her was something he was doing out of generosity. Claire let him finish. She waited until she was absolutely sure he was done speaking. Then she said quietly and clearly, "May I see the settlement terms?" Richard slid the document toward her. She read it. Every line, every clause. She turned each page slowly and read it the way someone reads something when they understand exactly what they're looking at. Daniel watched her and felt a flicker of something he almost immediately suppressed. Unease. Something in the way she read too calmly, too carefully made something in the back of his mind register as wrong. But the feeling passed, because Claire looked up from the papers, looked at Daniel, and said simply, "Okay." Just that. "Okay," Daniel blinked. "Okay, that's it?" "That's it. You don't want to, I don't know, take some time? Think about it?" Claire picked up the pen from the table. "I've had 8 years to think about it, Daniel." And she signed. Daniel walked out of that office building feeling like a man who had just crossed the finish line of a race he'd been running for years. He stood on the sidewalk and took a long breath of November air and actually smiled up at the sky. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Madison Carter, his assistant, who was 29, and ambitious, and laughed at all his jokes and never once made him feel like he wasn't the most impressive person in any room. The text said simply, "It's done." 3 seconds later, her response arrived finally. "Celebrating tonight?" He typed back, "Absolutely." He put the phone in his pocket and hailed a cab and leaned back against the seat as the city slid past the windows. And he thought about his future, the promotions coming, the lifestyle he was finally going to be able to build without apology, the version of himself that he'd always believed was just waiting to be released. He thought about Claire for exactly 30 seconds. He thought, she'll be fine, she's always fine. She has that quiet way of just absorbing whatever life throws at her. He didn't think of it as a compliment, he meant it as a dismissal. What he could not have imagined, what he would have laughed at if anyone had told him, was that in 3 days, the quiet woman he had just discarded with an 18-month settlement would walk into the most powerful corporate boardroom in his professional life. And he would have no idea who she was until it was far too late. Let's go back. Because to understand what Daniel was about to face, you need to understand what he never bothered to learn. Claire Reynolds was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a woman with nothing to offer. She was born the only child of Thomas and Margaret Reynolds. If those names mean nothing to you, it simply means you've never needed to know them, and that was exactly the way the Reynolds family preferred it. The Reynolds Legacy Foundation controlled interests across real estate, technology infrastructure, private equity, and media. Not in the flashy, headline-grabbing way that gets a family featured in business magazines. in the quiet foundational way, the kind of ownership that exists in the layer beneath the layer most people see. If you had tried to trace the full extent of the Reynolds family holdings, you would have needed 3 teams of attorneys, 2 forensic accountants, and several months you'd never get back. And at the end of all that work, the number you'd arrive at had enough zeros in it that most people's minds simply refused to process it as real. Thomas and Margaret Reynolds died in a private plane accident when Claire was 22 years old. She was their sole heir. By the time she was 23, Claire Reynolds was, technically and legally, one of the wealthiest individuals in North America. She never told anyone, not her college friends, not the neighbors who saw her at the grocery store, not the doormen at her building, not the co-workers at the small nonprofit where she spent 2 years answering phones and filing grant applications and making $11 an hour because she genuinely wanted to know what normal felt like. And not Daniel. Why not Daniel? This is the question people would ask later, after everything came out, after the story became the kind of thing that spread through offices and dinner tables and quiet conversations between people who recognized something true in it. Why wouldn't she tell the man she married? Claire answered this question once in an interview, and her answer was so simple that it stopped the interviewer cold. She said, "I had spent my entire life watching people perform for my family's money. My parents' friends, their business associates, people who wanted to be near them, people who wanted to date me, every single relationship I had ever witnessed was contaminated by the awareness of what we owned. I wanted one relationship, just one where I knew, absolutely and without any doubt, that the person beside me was there because of me. Not because of what I had." "And did you find that?" the interviewer asked. Claire was quiet for a moment. "I found out the answer," she said. "That's not exactly the same thing." She had met Daniel 7 months after her parents died. She was in a coffee shop near Columbia University, where she had been taking a few graduate courses, not pursuing a degree, just learning, staying busy, trying to remember what it felt like to be interested in something. She had a stack of economics papers in front of her, and a red pen, and the focused expression of someone who genuinely cared about what they were reading. Daniel had walked in, ordered something, looked around for a seat, and because the place was packed, asked if the chair across from her was taken. She said no. He sat down. And for the next 40 minutes, completely uninvited but somehow not unwelcome, he talked to her about his work, his goals, his belief in the connection between sound institutional strategy and long-term national growth. And before either of them quite knew what had happened, they were having an actual conversation, a real one, where both people were contributing and neither one was performing. He didn't know who she was. That had never happened to Claire before. She had always been introduced as a Reynolds, or as the daughter of Thomas and Margaret, or in some coded ways that signaled to the room exactly what her last name meant. But this man in the coffee shop looked at her and saw a woman with a red pen and interesting opinions about macroeconomic theory, and that was all. She gave him her number that day, not because she had decided anything, but because for the first time in a very long time, she felt like just a person. The early years were real. She was certain of that even now, even after everything. Daniel had been genuinely warm in the beginning, genuinely curious about her. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He called when he said he would. He remembered things she mentioned, in passing her favorite kind of tea, the name of a book she wanted to read, the anniversary of her parents' death, which she had mentioned once quietly, and he had noted and never forgotten. He was not performing. She would have seen through a performance. He was just a man who was at that point in his life still capable of being present for someone else. The change was slow, so slow that Claire almost missed it. It started with small things. The way he began talking about money, not with ambition, which she understood and respected, but with a kind of hunger that had an edge to it. The ways he started commenting on other couples they saw at restaurants, noting who was successful and who wasn't, measuring people against some internal scale that he'd never shown her before. The way he looked at her when she wore her regular clothes to an event where other women were, in designer dresses, not embarrassed exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that made her feel, for the first time, like she was falling short of an expectation she'd never agreed to meet. She tried once, early in this shift, to talk to him about it. "Daniel, I feel like lately you see me differently. Like I'm not measuring up to something. I just want to understand what changed." And Daniel, the version of Daniel who still had some decency left in him, looked at her with something that might have been guilt and said, "Nothing changed. I just have a lot of pressure right now, I'm sorry." And she believed him, because she wanted to. Because the alternative that the man she loved was slowly becoming someone who valued appearances over everything real was a truth she wasn't ready to carry yet. The Madison Carter situation had started 8 months before the divorce papers. Claire was not a fool. She had noticed it the first time she met Madison, the way Daniel's posture changed slightly when his assistant walked into the room, the way his laugh became a half-second louder, the way Madison always seemed to be exactly wherever Daniel happened to be standing. Claire had said something, not an accusation, a conversation. "I've noticed how close you and Madison have become. I want to talk about it." Daniel's response was immediate and irritated. "That's a professional relationship. I can't believe you would even suggest otherwise. Madison is essential to my work. Do you want me to be less effective at my job because you're insecure?" He turned it around so fast that for a moment Claire actually wondered if she was the problem. That's how it works when someone is very good at it. They move so quickly from the actual subject to your character that you end up defending yourself before you can return to the original question. She didn't push it. She watched. She was very good at watching. She saw the way Daniel talked about himself differently when Madison was in the room. She noticed the Friday evenings that ran later and later. She noticed the way he checked his phone at dinner, with an urgency he never used to have. She didn't confront him again, not because she was afraid of the answer, but because she had already arrived at her own answer, and it was not about Madison. Madison was a symptom. The disease was something deeper. Daniel had come to believe that Claire was a ceiling on his ambitions rather than a partner in his life. He had looked at her simplicity, her refusal to perform wealth she didn't need to display, her genuine disinterest in status games, her preference for quiet evenings over networking events, and he had misread every one of those qualities. He looked at her peace and called it complacency. He looked at her humility and called it mediocrity. He looked at her love and called it dependency. And somewhere in the process of misreading her, he had convinced himself that removing her from his life was the brave and necessary thing to do. 3 days after the divorce papers were signed, Daniel came home to his apartment, his alone now. The Connecticut place formally transferred, and poured himself to drink and stood at the window looking out at the cities. And he felt something he hadn't expected. He felt light, not happy exactly, but unencumbered. Like he had set down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was heavy. He called Madison. "You should come over," he said. "I'll be there in an hour," she said. He smiled and topped off his glass. The phone he wasn't looking at buzzed with a notification. He ignored it. It was an internal memo from Apex Meridian's corporate communications team. The subject line read, "Major Announcement, Leadership Transition." He would read it in the morning, he decided. In the morning, everything would be fine. In the morning, he would begin the chapter of his life that was finally, undeniably his. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea. Inside Apex Meridian's headquarters, 4 blocks from Daniel's apartment, in a corner office that almost no one ever saw the inside of, a meeting was ending. The company's CEO, Arthur Graves, 63 years old, careful, a man who had survived 20 years of corporate politics by never underestimating anyone, was standing across a conference table from a woman he had spent months preparing for this moment. "Everything's in place," he said. "The board announcement goes out tomorrow." "The auditorium event is Friday." The woman across from him nodded once. She was holding a glass of water, and she looked at the table in front of her with an expression of quiet resolution, not excitement. not nervousness. Just the clear-eyed readiness of someone who has been preparing for something for a very long time and is simply ready to do it. "And everyone on the executive team?" she asked. "All informed as of this afternoon," Arthur said. All of them, she repeated. "Including the Strategic Development Division?" Arthur nodded carefully, including SVP Whitmore, yes. The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she set down her glass of water and picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "Then I'll see you Friday morning," she said. She left. Arthur Graves stood alone in the conference room for a long moment after the door closed. He had been in business for 40 years. He had seen a great deal. He had watched fortunes made and companies collapse and careers built and reputations destroyed. But he had never quite seen anything like what he suspected was about to happen. He turned off the conference room light. Somewhere across the city, Daniel Whitmore was pouring himself another drink, feeling like a man who had just set himself free. And in the morning, the announcement would go out. And the world Daniel Whitmore had spent his entire career building was about to reveal the one thing he had never thought to look for at its foundation. The name it was standing on. The morning after Daniel Whitmore signed those divorce papers, he slept like a man without a single regret in his body. And that, more than anything else, told you everything you needed to know about who he had become. He woke up at 7:15, stretched his arms wide across the empty bed, and smiled at the ceiling. Madison was already gone. She had an early meeting, she'd said, kissing him on the cheek in the dark before slipping out. He lay there for a full minute just listening to the silence of the apartment, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Unburdened, that was the word his mind reached for. Like a man who had been carrying a stone in his chest for so long he forgot it was there, and now suddenly, miraculously, it was gone. He showered. He dressed carefully. He made coffee and stood at the window looking out at Manhattan spreading wide below him in the gray November morning, and he thought, this is the beginning. This is finally actually the beginning. He didn't think about Claire once while he drank that coffee. Not once. Claire, meanwhile, had been awake since 4 a.m. Not crying, not pacing, not calling anyone. She sat at the small desk in the spare bedroom of a friend's apartment. She had stayed there the last 2 nights. Unwilling to return to the home she had shared with Daniel, and she had her laptop open and a phone pressed to her ear, and she was working. Quietly, methodically, with the kind of focused efficiency that people who have never seen her in her true element would have found completely unrecognizable. "The board meeting is confirmed for Thursday," said the voice on the other end. His name was Gerald Whitfield. He was 61 years old and had been the Reynolds family's primary legal and financial advisor since before Claire was born. He had watched her grow up. He had managed the estate through her parents' deaths, through the years she disappeared into ordinary life, through every decision she had made since. He was one of perhaps 4 people on Earth who knew the full picture of what Claire Reynolds actually owned. "And the Apex Meridian announcement?" she asked. "Arthur Graves has everything prepared." "The public announcement goes out Friday morning. The auditorium event is Friday afternoon." "How many people currently know it's me on the board?" "All 12. In the executive suite as of yesterday evening, all 7. Below that level, no one. Claire was quiet for a moment. She turned a pen over slowly in her fingers, a habit she had when she was thinking carefully. "Gerald," she said, "I need you to make sure something is handled correctly. Of course, the Reynolds Foundation's ownership stake in Apex Meridian. I want the full documentation prepared, the original acquisition records, the chain of title, everything going back to when my father first invested. I want it assembled in a format that leaves absolutely no room for confusion." Gerald paused. "You're expecting someone to question it?" "I'm expecting someone to be very surprised," Claire said. "And surprised people sometimes look for reasons to disbelieve what they're seeing." Gerald understood immediately. He had known Claire long enough to read between every word she said. "It'll be ready," he said. She thanked him, ended the call, and sat in the silence of the early morning. Outside, the city was just beginning to stir. She could hear distant traffic, a siren somewhere far away, the ordinary sounds of the world going about its business. She thought about Daniel's face when he slid those papers across the table. The smile on his face, the absolute bone-deep confidence that he was the one with all the power. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them, straightened her posture, and went back to work. Because Claire Reynolds had never been someone who wasted time on what was already done. She was someone who prepared for what came next, and what came next was going to change everything. Inside Apex Meridian's headquarters that same morning, something was happening that Daniel noticed but did not correctly interpret. He arrived at the office at 8:45, which was early for him on a Wednesday. He rode the elevator to the 22nd floor, where the executive suite lived, and he stepped out into the corridor and felt immediately that the air was different. People were moving differently. There were small clusters of conversations that dissolved when he walked near them. Assistants were unusually focused on their screens. Two of his fellow senior vice presidents, Marcus Webb from Operations and Diane Cho from Investor Relations, were standing near the coffee station, talking in low voices, and when they saw Daniel approach, they both smiled in that particular way that means we were just talking about something, and we're not going to tell you what it was. "Morning," Daniel said. "Morning, Daniel," Marcus said. "Big day, what do you mean?" Marcus glanced at Diane. Something passed between them. "You get the memo?" he asked. Daniel thought about the notification he had ignored last night. "I saw there was something, haven't read it yet." Another glance between Marcus and Diane. "Barely perceptible. But there, you should read it," Diane said, and her voice was careful in a way that Daniel registered without understanding. He went to his office, closed the door, and opened the internal communications system. The memo was from Arthur Graves himself, which was already unusual. Arthur sent company-wide communications perhaps twice a year, and they were always ceremonial holiday messages, annual performance summaries, that kind of thing. He did not send Wednesday morning memos. Daniel read the subject line, "Leadership Transition Reynolds Legacy Foundation assumes direct operational control." He read it twice, then he opened the body of the memo. The language was formal and careful in the way that corporate language always is when it's trying to deliver significant news without causing immediate panic. The Reynolds Legacy Foundation, which had held a controlling majority stake in Apex Meridian for the past 11 years, had elected to move from passive investment to active leadership. A new chairwoman would be assuming oversight of the company's strategic direction, effective immediately. There would be a formal introduction at an all-hands events this Friday at 2 p.m. in the corporate auditorium. Attendance was mandatory for all executive and senior staff. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the Reynolds Legacy Foundation. He knew the name, of course. Everyone in the building knew the name. The foundation was Apex Meridian's majority owner, had been for over a decade, but it had always been a silent presence. A name on documents, a line in the company's ownership structure that nobody ever thought much about, because the foundation had never, in all the years Daniel had worked here, made any visible move to interfere with how the company was run. Until now, he thought about what this meant for his career. That was the first place his mind went, not curiosity about the foundation, not genuine interest in the company's direction, but immediate, reflexive calculation about how this development would affect Daniel Whitmore's trajectory. A new chairwoman could mean new allies to cultivate, new relationships to build, new opportunities for someone ambitious enough to position himself correctly. He reached for his phone and called his most reliable source of corporate intelligence, a man named Philip Cross, who worked in the legal department and had an uncanny ability to know things before they became official. "Philip, talk to me about this Reynolds Foundation memo." Philip's voice on the other end was careful, almost too careful. "What do you want to know? Who is she?" The new chairwoman. A pause, and in that pause Daniel felt the first real flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Something that wasn't quite unease but was close to it. "They haven't released the name publicly yet," Philip said. The announcement is Friday. Come on, someone knows. Another pause. Longer this time, Daniel, Philip said slowly. I think this one you need to wait for the official announcement. Why just wait for the announcement? Daniel stared at his desk after he hung up. Philip Cross had never refused to give him information before. Not once in 6 years. Something was happening that he didn't have the pieces to understand yet. He pushed the feeling down, told himself it didn't matter, and opened his calendar to prepare for his 10 o'clock. He was wrong. It mattered enormously. What Daniel didn't know, what he had never thought to ask, never thought to research, never thought to wonder about in 8 years of marriage, was the complete story of the woman he had just divorced. He knew Claire's last name was Reynolds. He had never connected it to anything, because Reynolds is not an uncommon name, and because Claire had never given him any reason to look deeper. She drove a practical car. She bought groceries at the regular store. She wore clothes that didn't announce themselves. She had lived beside him for 8 years in a way that gave him absolutely no thread to pull. But let's pull the thread now. Because the story of how Claire Reynolds came to own a controlling stake in the company her husband worked for is not a simple one, and it is exactly the kind of story that, when you hear it in full, makes you understand why she kept it hidden. Thomas Reynolds had been a man of extraordinary financial intelligence and almost pathological discretion. He had built the Reynolds family fortune not through public spectacle but through quiet, precise, long-term investment infrastructure, technology, private equity, real estate, always through holding companies and foundations that kept the family name several layers removed from the public record. He invested in Apex Meridian 11 years ago, not because the company was glamorous, but because he identified something in its underlying technology portfolio that he believed would become the backbone of a significant portion of American digital infrastructure over the following decade. He was right. He was almost always right. When Thomas and Margaret died, Claire inherited controlling interest in the Reynolds Legacy Foundation, which meant she inherited controlling interest in everything the foundation owned. Including Apex Meridian Corporation, she had never exercised that control. Not once in all the years since her parents died had she inserted herself into the company's operations. She trusted Arthur Graves, who had been her father's choice to run the company's day-to-day leadership, and Arthur Graves had proven worthy of that trust. But things had been changing at Apex Meridian for the past 18 months. Changes in culture, in the way people were being promoted and dismissed, in the values that seemed to be rewarded and the ones that were being quietly punished. Gerald Whitfield had been flagging these concerns to Claire in their monthly reports. Arthur Graves had raised them himself, carefully and diplomatically, that Claire has listened to with growing attention. She had already made the decision to step in before Daniel ever placed those divorce papers on the table. The divorce had nothing to do with it, or rather the divorce confirmed something she had already suspected. That the environment her company was operating in had begun to reward exactly the kind of person Daniel had become. Calculating, image-focused, willing to step on the people who helped them rise. That was the culture she was coming to change. And Daniel, without knowing it, had handed her the clearest possible example of what needed to change and why. Thursday came with a cold front that pushed the temperature down into the 30s. Daniel spent most of the day in back-to-back meetings, preparing for the quarterly strategy review that was supposed to be his moment to shine. His division had performed exceptionally well, and he had a presentation ready that he believed would be the kind of thing that caught the attention of new leadership. He was in his office at 4:30, reviewing the last slides, when his assistant knocked and opened the door 6 inches. "Daniel, there's a call holding. It's from Gerald Whitfield's office." Daniel looked up. "Who?" "Gerald Whitfield. He says he's calling on behalf of the Reynolds Legacy Foundation." Daniel felt his pulse do something unusual. "Put it through." The voice on the line was precise and professionally warm. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for taking my call. I'm calling to confirm your inclusion on the executive briefing list for tomorrow's announcement." We wanted to make personal contact with all senior staff in advance of the public event. I appreciate that, Daniel said, keeping his voice smooth. Can you tell me anything about the new chairwoman before the official announcement? It would help me prepare. A pause on the other end. Professional, measured. The chairwoman prefers to make her own introduction tomorrow, Gerald said. I can tell you that she has been deeply familiar with Apex Meridian for many years. Longer than most people realize. That's reassuring, Daniel said, and meant it as a networking move, the kind of thing you say to people who work for powerful people, so they remember you as agreeable. I imagine it will be, Gerald said, and something in his voice was so precisely neutral that it almost sounded like the opposite of neutral. The call ended. Daniel sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Longer than most people realize, he shook it off, put the phone down. Went back to his slides. That night, Massison came over and they ordered food, and Daniel talked about his presentation and his plans and his certainty that the new leadership transition was going to open doors for him rather than close them. And Madison listened and laughed in the right places and told him he was going to be incredible tomorrow. And Daniel felt the warmth of being admired and said nothing about the small, persistent unease that had been living in the back of his chest since Wednesday morning. He was good at ignoring things that made him uncomfortable. He had a lot of practice. Friday morning arrived like a verdict. Daniel was in the office by 8. He was dressed better than usual, a suit he reserved for important occasions, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and was cut precisely enough that even people who didn't care about clothes noticed it. He had his presentation materials ready. He had done everything right by every metric he understood. He even managed to push down the unease completely, at least for the first few hours. The all-hands event was at 2. By 11, the executive floor was humming with a particular kind of energy that Daniel recognized as the atmosphere before a significant announcement-controlled excitement. People moving with purpose, assistants carrying things from place to place. He ran into Marcus Webb in the corridor at 11:30. Ready for this afternoon? Marcus asked. Born ready, Daniel said, which was the kind of thing he said when he wanted to seem confident. Marcus looked at him for a moment with an expression Daniel couldn't read. Yeah, Marcus said, I bet. At 12:15, Daniel's assistant came to his door again. Daniel, Arthur Graves would like to see you. Daniel straightened his jacket. This was it, he thought. Pre-announcement meeting. Arthur pulling him aside to let him know he was being considered for something. This was exactly the kind of thing that happened to people who had positioned themselves correctly. He walked to Arthur's office with his chin up. Arthur Graves was standing behind his desk when Daniel entered, which was unusual. Arthur almost always sat. He was a man who projected authority through stillness, and right now he was not still. Daniel, sit down. Daniel sat. Arthur looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man choosing his words very carefully. I want to talk to you before this afternoon, Arthur said. As a professional courtesy, I appreciate that, Arthur. The chairwoman who will be announced today has been briefed extensively on Apex Meridian's executive team. She's familiar with performance records, personnel files, and the personal histories of senior staff. Daniel nodded. That's thorough it is, Arthur paused. She's also, and I want you to hear this clearly, before you walk into that auditorium, she's someone with a direct personal familiarity with certain members of this team. Something moved in Daniel's chest, something cold. What does that mean? He asked. Arthur held his gaze. It means that what happens this afternoon may be different from what you're expecting, Daniel. I think you should be prepared for that. Daniel opened his mouth. Closed it, opened it again. Arthur, can you just tell me? The announcement speaks for itself, Arthur said quietly. I've done what I can do. Daniel left Arthur's office and walked back down the corridor, and he felt, for the first time all week, genuinely afraid. Not the productive anxiety of ambition. The cold, clarifying fear of a man who has begun to sense that he has made an error he cannot name yet, that somewhere in the recent past, without realizing it, he stepped off solid ground. He checked his phone. He had a text from Madison, something light and encouraging. He stared at it and felt nothing. He thought about Claire. For the first time since Tuesday morning, he actually thought about her. Not as a problem solved, not as a chapter closed, as a person. Specifically as a person he realized he had never fully seen. He thought about the way she signed those papers, the way she read every line, the way she said okay and meant something more than agreement. He stood in the corridor outside his office, and the thought formed slowly like a shape emerging from fog. What if he had missed something? What if there was something about Claire, something he never asked about, never looked for, never thought to question, that he had been standing next to for 8 years without seeing? He pushed it away. It was too large and too uncomfortable, and the auditorium event was in less than 2 hours, and he needed to be focused. He went back to his office. He closed the door. He stared at the presentation on his screen, the one about growth metrics and strategic positioning, and all the ways his division had performed brilliantly, and for the first time it felt hollow. Like he had prepared for the wrong test. The corporate auditorium at Apex Meridian held 400 people. By 1:50, it was standing room only. Every executive, every senior staff member, every team lead and department head who had received the mandatory attendance notice was there. The room had the particular electricity of collective anticipation, hundreds of people who all knew something significant was about to happen, but none of them, below a certain level, knew exactly what. Daniel found a seat near the front, not because he wanted to be seen for once in his professional life. Being seen was not his primary concern. He sat near the front because some part of him needed to see clearly. The lights shifted at exactly 2 o'clock. Arthur Graves walked onto the stage alone. He stood at the podium and waited for the room to quiet, and when it did, he spoke without preamble. Apex Meridian has operated for 60 years as a company that values performance, growth, and excellence. Today, we are entering a new chapter. One that will honor those values while recommitting to the principles that make excellence, sustainable integrity, character, and the kind of leadership that lifts everyone in the organization rather than simply the people at the top. He paused. It is my honor to introduce the chairwoman of the Reynolds Legacy Foundation and the new executive chairwoman of Apex Meridian Corporation. And then he said her name, Claire Reynolds. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. And then she walked onto the stage, and Daniel Whitmore's entire world collapsed in on itself so completely and so suddenly that for a moment he could not breathe, could not move, could not process what his eyes were showing him. Because it was her, it was Claire. But it was a version of Claire he had never seen in 8 years of marriage. She wore a white blazer, fitted and precise. Her posture was different, not changed exactly, but revealed. Like something that had always been there was no longer being held back. She walked to the podium the way people walk when they are completely, unshakably comfortable with where they are and who they are. The room was completely silent. 400 people watching her, and not one of them spoke. And Claire looked out over the auditorium with calm, clear eyes, and she began to speak. I have been watching this company for a very long time, she said. Her voice was even, steady, long enough to understand its strengths deeply and to see its vulnerabilities clearly. She paused. I've learned something in that time that I want to share with everyone in this room today. Performance matters, results matter, but they are not the only things that matter. The question of who you are when no one is watching, the question of how you treat people who cannot advance your career, that question has always mattered more than the numbers on any quarterly report. And going forward, it will be reflected in every decision this company makes about who leads and who advances within these walls. Daniel sat very still. He was aware that his face needed to be neutral. He was aware that people around him might be looking at him, might be connecting things, might already know things that he was only now understanding. He held himself very still and stared at the woman on the stage. The woman he had called nothing, the woman he had laughed at. The woman he had discarded with an 18-month settlement and a smile because he was absolutely certain she had nothing to offer and nowhere to go and no power of any kind. the woman who owned the company he worked for. Claire's eyes moved across the room slowly, taking in the audience with the unhurried certainty of someone who does not need to rush. And then for one moment, brief and precise, like a single camera frame, her gaze landed on Daniel Whitmore. She didn't flinch, she didn't pause, her expression did not change. She simply looked at him the way she had looked at him across the table on Tuesday, with that quiet, devastating clarity that was not anger and was not triumph and was not satisfaction. It was something closer to the final confirmation of something she had suspected for a very long time. And then her gaze moved on, and she continued speaking, and Daniel sat in his chair in the crowded auditorium and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely, completely small. Not humbled in the way that ambition sometimes bends. Small. The way you feel when you realize that the story you have been telling yourself, the one where you are the protagonist, the rising star, the man who makes the right moves, was built on a foundation you never examined. The woman he threw away was the foundation she had been the whole time. And he had laughed while signing the papers that handed it all back to her. The applause began slowly and built, and the room filled with the sound of 400 people welcoming a leader they were only now meeting, and Daniel Whitmore sat very still in the middle of all that sound and understood, with the full weight of absolute clarity, that the greatest mistake of his life had not been made in some distant, theoretical future. It had been made on Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock, in a lawyer's office on Park Avenue, when he slid a pen across a table and laughed at a woman who had been holding his entire world in the palm of her hand. The applause had barely faded from the auditorium when Daniel's phone started vibrating. He looked down at the screen, 11 text messages in 4 minutes. He didn't read any of them, he couldn't. His eyes were still tracking Claire as she stepped away from the podium, shook Arthur Graves' hand, and began moving through the front row of executives with the calm, deliberate presence of someone who had been preparing for this moment for years. Which of course she had. Daniel stood up slowly from his chair. His legs felt strange, not weak exactly, but uncertain, like the floor had shifted a quarter inch in a direction no one else noticed. Around him, people were rising, talking, moving toward the aisles. He heard his name spoken once, twice, from different directions, but the voices blurred together into something he couldn't process. He needed air. He moved toward the side exit, shoulders back, chin level, performing composure with every muscle in his body. He had spent 15 years learning how to look unaffected, and that skill was the only thing keeping him upright right now. He pushed through the door into the corridor and leaned against the wall and breathed. His phone vibrated again. This time he looked. It was Marcus Webb. The text said simply, "Knew you'd want a heads up, didn't know how to give you one." Sorry, man. Daniel stared at that text for a long time. Didn't know how to give you one, which meant Marcus had known. Which meant some of them had known at least partially, at least enough to recognize that this announcement was going to land differently for Daniel than for anyone else in that room. He thought about Diane Cho's face Wednesday morning at the coffee station. You should read the memo. He thought about Philip Cross refusing to give him the name. He thought about Arthur Graves standing behind his desk and saying, "What happens this afternoon may be different from what you're expecting." They all knew, and not one of them told him directly, because not one of them knew how to say, "Daniel, the woman you just divorced on Tuesday is about to walk into this building on Friday and own every single one of us." He put the phone in his pocket and stared at the wall in front of him. And then, because Daniel Whitmore had never in his adult life been able to simply sit with a difficult truth when there was still a move to make, he straightened up, adjusted his jacket, and went looking for Claire. He found her 40 minutes later. She was in a conference room on the executive floor, seated at the head of the table with Gerald Whitfield on her right and Arthur Graves on her left. 2 other people Daniel didn't recognize were at the far end, their laptops open, their attention completely on Claire. Through the glass panel in the corridor, he could see her speaking, gesturing once at a document, listening when Gerald responded, nodding with the precise, economical nod of someone who processes information quickly and moves forward. He stood outside that glass panel for 90 seconds. He watched his ex-wife, who had been his ex-wife for exactly 72 hours, run a room full of some of the sharpest people in his professional world, and he felt something he had no framework for. He had spent 8 years interpreting Claire's quietness as absence, as lack as evidence that she was simply not operating at the level he was. What he understood now, watching her through the glass, was that her quietness had never been absence. It had been discipline. The specific, practiced discipline of someone who has learned to hold enormous power lightly, without broadcasting it, without needing the room to know. He had mistaken her restraint for her ceiling. Her ceiling was somewhere he couldn't even see from where he was standing. He knocked on the conference room door. Everyone looked up. Gerald's expression didn't change. Arthur's face did something careful and controlled. The two people at the end glanced at each other. Claire looked at him. Just looked, with that same quality she'd had in the lawyer's office. "Clear, steady, finished," she said, not a greeting. Not a question. Just the acknowledgement that he existed and was standing in the doorway. "I need 5 minutes," he said. The room was silent. Claire held his gaze for a moment, then looked at Gerald. "Give us a few minutes." Gerald nodded once and stood, and the others followed him out, and they moved past Daniel in the doorway without looking at him. And then the door closed, and it was just the two of them for the first time since Tuesday, and the silence between them had a weight that Daniel felt physically. He sat down, not at the head of the table, not across from her in the power position. He sat down 2 seats away, at the side of the table, and he folded his hands and looked at her. "Claire, before you say anything," she said quietly, "I want you to understand something. This meeting is a professional courtesy, nothing more. I am not giving you this time because of our history. I'm giving it to you because you knocked on the door, and I believe people deserve to be heard once." Once, he nodded. He had prepared a speech on the walk up here, some version of "I was wrong. I made a mistake. I need you to understand," but sitting across from her now, in the quiet of that conference room, with the reality of who she was and what he had done laid out between them, like something that couldn't be folded back up, the speech felt grotesque. So he didn't give the speech. Instead, he said the only true thing he could find. "I didn't know who you were." Claire looked at him steadily. I didn't know any of it. The foundation, the company, any of it. I had no idea. I know that too, Daniel, if I had known. Stop. Her voice was still quiet, but there was something in it now that made him stop instantly. Not anger. Finality. What you're about to say is that if you had known, things would have been different. And you need to understand why that sentence is exactly the problem. He opened his mouth, she continued. "You're telling me that the information about my wealth would have changed how you treated me. You're saying that money was the variable, that if I had told you about the foundation, about the company, about what I inherited, you would have stayed. You would have been kind, you would have valued me." He didn't answer, because she was right and they both knew it. "Daniel," she said, and for a fraction of a second, something moved behind her eyes that might have been grief, or might have been the last remnant of something that used to be love. "That's not a defense. That's a confession." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Daniel had ever heard. She stood up. "My team is waiting. I think you should go." He stood too. He felt the desperate, clawing impulse to say something that would change the temperature of the room, some combination of words that would shift the balance, make her see him differently, give him something to hold on to. But he was out of words that meant anything real. He walked to the door and put his hand on the handle and then stopped. "What happens to my position?" he asked. He hated himself for asking it. But he asked it. Claire met his eyes. "That will be determined through the standard review process," she said. Like everyone else, he left. He walked down the corridor and pressed the elevator button and stood waiting with his hands in his pockets and his face completely, carefully composed, And when the doors opened, he stepped in and the doors closed behind him, and for one vertical minute, alone in the elevator, the composure failed completely. He pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes and breathed through something that was very close to the feeling he imagined drowning would feel like. Then the elevator reached the lobby, the doors opened. He walked out. He didn't go back to his office that afternoon. He told his assistant he had a migraine and went home. In the week that followed, Daniel learned what it felt like to exist inside a story that everyone around you already knows the ending of. His colleagues didn't avoid him exactly, it was more subtle than that. Conversations became shorter. Invitations to the kinds of informal strategy discussions that executive floor people naturally gravitated toward, the ones that happened in someone's office over coffee, the ones that weren't on any calendar, stopped arriving. People who used to stop by his door with questions now solved their own problems or asked someone else. He wasn't being punished. That was the thing that made it worse, in a way. No one was doing anything to him deliberately. It was more that the gravity in the building had shifted, and he was feeling the effect of no longer being near the center of it. The center was Claire. She moved through Apex Meridian with a quiet efficiency that people responded to in ways they couldn't quite articulate. She remembered names. She asked questions that showed she had actually read the reports she'd been given. In her first week, she sat in on 4 departmental meetings in 4 different divisions, not to perform oversight, but to listen. To understand what the people inside the company actually needed. Word traveled as word always travels in organizations that are paying attention. Daniel heard it from 3 different people on 3 different days. She asked me directly what I thought the biggest obstacle in my department was. And she actually wrote it down. She knew my name without being introduced. She'd done her homework. She's not what I expected. She's I don't know. She makes you feel like what you say matters. Each time someone said something like this to Daniel, they seemed to remember a half-second later who they were talking to and why this topic was complicated. And then the conversation moved on quickly. And Daniel was left with the accumulating weight of understanding what he had never understood when he had the chance to. He had been given a decade of proximity to that person. He had been given 8 years of her full attention, her loyalty, her patience, her genuine and uncomplicated love. And he had spent those years looking past her at some idealized future that was further away than he thought and less real than he believed. 2 weeks after the auditorium announcement, Madison Carter came to his office and closed the door. He had been aware that something was happening with Madison. She had been quieter than usual, slower to respond to his messages. There had been 2 evenings in the past week where she had canceled plans with explanations that were perfectly reasonable, somehow felt like something other than what they were. She sat down across from him and looked at him with an expression he recognized with sick clarity, as the expression of someone who has made a decision and is now carrying out the final administrative step. "Daniel," she said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." "Okay," he said. "I think we moved too fast. And I think the timing of everything with the announcement with Claire being—" She paused and started again. "I just don't think this is working the way I thought it would." He watched her. "Is this about Claire?" he asked. Madison looked at the desk. "It's about a lot of things. It's about the fact that my career trajectory just became a lot less certain," he said quietly. Not angrily, just accurately. Madison didn't deny it. That at least was honest. "I think I need some space," she said. "Okay," he said again. She left. He sat in his office after she was gone and thought about the irony of watching someone choose to leave him, for the same reason he had chosen to leave Claire, the belief that staying meant being attached to something that wasn't going up. He had done this. He had built this specific dynamic. He had operated on the assumption that relationships were investments, that people were either assets or liabilities depending on what they could produce. He had found someone who thought exactly the same way. And it turned out that kind of thinking, when you were no longer the most attractive investment in the room, left you very alone very quickly. The performance review arrived in his inbox on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the announcement. It was not what he'd feared, exactly. He hadn't been fired. He hadn't been demoted with the kind of formal, humiliating abruptness that would have made it clean. It was something more precise than that. His division was being restructured. His role would be absorbed into a larger strategic department. His title would change. His direct reports would be redistributed. There was language about alignment with new organizational priorities and refocusing of resources, and underneath all that language was the unmistakable shape of a diminishment that stopped just short of being punitive. He read it 3 times and then called Richard Harmon, his attorney. "Is there anything actionable here?" he asked. Richard was quiet for a moment. "Based on what you're describing, it sounds like a standard restructuring. Are there any documented performance issues that predate the change in leadership?" "No. Any indication the changes are targeted specifically at you?" Daniel thought about that. "No. She's restructuring 3 other divisions too." "Then there's no basis for a complaint, Daniel. Companies restructure. Leadership changes direction. Without evidence of targeting, there's nothing here." He put the phone down. He sat in the quiet of his office, the office that would soon belong to someone else or not exist in the same form, and he thought about something Claire had said in that brief, devastating conference room meeting. "That's not a defense, that's a confession." He turned those words over carefully. He had confessed, without meaning to, that he was the kind of person whose treatment of others was conditional on what those others could do for him. That his kindness was an investment strategy, that his love was a transaction. And the thing about that confession was that it wasn't just about Claire. It was about everyone. It was about the colleagues he had looked past. The assistants he had been careless with. The people in his division whose names he hadn't learned because they weren't senior enough to matter to his career. He had been operating this way for so long that he had stopped seeing it as a choice. It had become just the way things worked, the way people worked. Claire had seen it differently. From the very beginning, apparently, she had seen it differently. And she had stayed long enough to be certain, and then she had let him go, and she had not looked back once. He pulled up his computer and stared at the restructuring document. Then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He started thinking about other people, not as assets or liabilities. Not as rungs on a ladder or obstacles in a path. He started thinking about 3 specific people in his division who were genuinely talented, who had worked hard under his leadership, and who were probably anxious right now about what the restructuring meant for them. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Can you get me 30 minutes with the full strategic development team this afternoon? I want to talk to them before the restructuring memo goes public." "Of course," his assistant said, and something in her voice, a slight, almost inaudible shift, told him that this surprised her. It surprised him too, honestly, but he made the call. And that afternoon he sat in a room with 14 people who had worked for him for years. And he talked to them honestly about what was coming and what he knew and what he didn't know. And he answered their questions without the performance layer he usually operated behind. And at the end of it, a young analyst named Kevin, 24 years old, brilliant, had been trying to get 30 minutes of Daniel's attention, for 3 months stayed behind. "Thank you for doing this," Kevin said seriously. "Nobody tells us anything usually. It helps to hear it from you directly." Daniel looked at this young man, really looked at him, maybe for the first time. "I should have done it sooner," Daniel said. "I should have done a lot of things sooner." Kevin nodded and left, and Daniel sat alone in the empty conference room, with that sentence echoing back at him from the walls. "I should have done a lot of things sooner." 53 days after the divorce papers were signed, something happened that Daniel had not anticipated. He was leaving the building at 6:30 in the evening, later than most people, the executive floor nearly empty, when the elevator opened and Claire stepped out. They were alone in the corridor. Neither of them had anticipated this. It was clear from the micro-expression that crossed Claire's face in the first half-second, not alarm, not discomfort. just the subtle recalibration of someone managing an unexpected situation. They looked at each other. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And in that silence, 53 days of accumulated weight, everything he had done, everything she had endured, everything they had been to each other before it all went wrong, pressed itself into the space between them. "Working late," he said finally. It was a stupid thing to say. He knew it the moment it left his mouth. "Always," she said, simply. He nodded. She moved toward the office she had taken over at the end of the corridor, his father-in-law's old corner office, he realized for the first time. Thomas Reynolds's office in the company Thomas Reynolds had built from a quiet investment into a cornerstone of his legacy. "Claire," she stopped, turned. He looked at her, and this time he didn't try to be strategic or careful or calculated. He didn't try to find the right combination of words to move the outcome in a favorable direction. "I'm sorry," he said, "not for what it means for my career. Not because of what I didn't know about you, just I'm sorry for who I was. For 8 years you deserved better than what I gave you." "That's true, regardless of anything else." Claire looked at him for a long moment. The expression on her face was something he had never seen from her before. Not forgiveness exactly, not warmth, but something human. Something that acknowledged that the apology was real, even if it arrived too late to change anything. "I know you mean that," she said quietly. "I can hear that you mean it. But meaning it now doesn't rewrite what it was," she said. "You can't apologize someone back to a place that doesn't exist anymore. I'm not who I was when we started, and you're just beginning to find out who you actually are." She said it without cruelty, without satisfaction, with the same clarity she brought to everything. "Take care of yourself, Daniel," she said. And she turned and walked down the corridor and didn't look back. He stood at the elevator and watched her go, and what he felt in that moment was not grief exactly, though it was close to it. It was the specific, clarifying ache of a man who has finally arrived at the truth of something after being wrong about it for a very long time. He pressed the elevator button. He rode down to the lobby in silence. He walked out into the evening air of a city that was moving forward all around him, indifferent and relentless, and full of people making decisions that would define who they became. And he thought about what Claire had said. "You're just beginning to find out who you actually are." He had spent 36 years believing he already knew. He had been so certain of his own value, his own direction, his own rightness, that he had never once stopped to ask the question from the outside. Never once looked at himself the way the people around him saw him. Never once considered that the story he was living might look completely different from another angle. The quiet woman he had called nothing, the woman he had laughed at. She had known, from the very beginning of their relationship and through every year of it, exactly who she was. She had never needed a title to confirm it. She had never needed a room full of people watching her to feel certain of her own worth. She had simply been, consistently, completely without apology. And he had looked at that consistency and called it smallness. He walked 2 blocks before he hailed a cab. And in those 2 blocks, something in him that had been clenched tight for as long as he could remember began, slowly and painfully, to release. Not because things were going to be fine. They weren't, not in the way he had planned, not in the way he'd imagined his life going at this stage. But because for the first time in a very long time he was walking without performing. Without calculating. Without the constant, exhausting work of managing other people's perception of him as. Just walking. Just a man in a city at 6:30 on an ordinary evening, finally, honestly, beginning to understand the cost of never having looked at himself clearly. It was the worst feeling he had ever had. It was also, somewhere beneath the worst of it, the first honest thing. 3 days after that corridor encounter, Daniel Whitmore received a calendar invitation. The subject line read, "Strategic Development Division Restructuring Individual Transition Meeting." The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday at 9 a.m. The host was listed as Gerald Whitfield, representing the office of the executive chairwoman. Not Claire herself, Gerald. Daniel stared at that detail for a long time. Because he understood what it meant. It meant Claire was being professional in the most complete sense of the word, not avoiding him, not punishing him through proximity, but creating the appropriate institutional distance between her personal history and her professional responsibilities. She was handling his situation the way she would handle anyone's situation. Through the proper channels, through the right people. She was not going to make this personal, which, in its own way, was the most personal thing she could have done. He accepted the invitation and spent the weekend doing something he hadn't done. In years, he sat with discomfort instead of running from it. He didn't call anyone. He didn't make strategic plans. He didn't rehearse talking points for Monday's meeting or calculate how to position himself favorably with Gerald. He sat his apartment on Saturday evening with a glass of water, not even a drink, just water, and he let the full weight of the past 2 months settle onto him without trying to manage it. He thought about the first year of his marriage, the apartment they had then small, nothing like what he would later need to have, and the Sunday mornings that were genuinely good. Claire making coffee, reading something, laughing at something he said that was actually funny rather than just confident. The way she used to reach across the table and put her hand on top of his when he was worried about work, without saying anything, just that. The warmth of it. The uncomplicated, real warmth of someone who was there because they wanted to be. He had taken that apart piece by piece over 8 years. Not in one dramatic act, in 1,000 small dismissals. 1,000 moments where he chose his own reflection over the real person sitting across from him. Sunday passed slowly. Monday arrived like a door opening onto a room he wasn't ready to enter. Gerald Whitfield was 61 years old and had the manner of a man who had sat across from every type of person in every type of situation, and remained absolutely, professionally unreadable throughout all of it. He shook Daniel's hand, gestured to the chair across from him, opened a thin folder, and began speaking in the measured, precise tone of someone delivering information rather than judgment. Mr. Whitmore, thank you for coming in. I want to be direct with you about the restructuring and what it means for your position going forward. I appreciate that, Daniel said. Your division's work over the past 3 years has been, by objective metrics, strong. That's been noted and it's on record. The restructuring is not a performance action. I want to be clear about that, but... Gerald looked at him steadily. But the new organizational structure does not include your current role as a standalone position. The SVP of Strategic Development title will be dissolved. The function will be distributed across 3 existing departments, each led by a division head reporting directly to the chairwoman's office. Daniel processed this. What are my options? Gerald opened the folder slightly wider. You have 3. First, you can accept a lateral reassignment to Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships, different scope, different reporting structure, compensation adjusted accordingly. It's a meaningful role, though not at the same level as what you currently hold. He paused. Second, you can choose voluntary separation with a package that reflects your years of service and performance history. Third, you can remain in your current title through the end of the quarter while the transition is completed and make your decision within that window. Daniel looked at the folder. What does the chairwoman recommend? Gerald's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted by a fraction. The chairwoman's position is that this decision belongs entirely to you. She has asked me to convey that there is no preferred outcome on her part. Whatever you decide will be treated with complete professional respect. No preferred outcome. Daniel turned those words over. They were so carefully chosen they almost hurt. She wasn't pushing him out. She wasn't keeping him close. She was giving him the thing she had always given him, even when he didn't deserve it. A genuine choice. I need a few days, he said. You have 2 weeks, Gerald said. The package terms are in here. He slid a document across the table. Take the time you need. Daniel took the document. He stood. He shook Gerald's hand again. At the door he stopped. He turned back. Gerald, he paused, choosing words carefully. How long have you known Claire? Gerald looked at him with the particular stillness of someone deciding how much to say. Since she was 4 years old, he said finally. Daniel nodded slowly. Then you know you've always known what she is. What she's capable of. Yes, Gerald said simply. Did you ever? He stopped. Started again. Did she ever talk about our marriage to you? Gerald was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is itself an answer. She talked about wanting it to be real, Gerald said. That was what mattered to her, not the money, not the company, not what she came from. Just real. Daniel walked out without another word. He took the stairs down instead of the elevator, because he needed the extra minutes before he was back in the world where people could see his face. He used every one of them. The story broke on a Tuesday. It wasn't supposed to. These things rarely are supposed to. But New York has always been a city where secrets travel faster than truth, and somewhere in the weeks since the auditorium announcement, someone had connected enough dots to bring the full picture to a journalist who knew exactly what to do with it. The headline read, "Trillionaire Heiress takes control of Apex Meridian and her ex-husband works there." Daniel read it on his phone at 7:15 in the morning, before he had even gotten out of bed, and felt the specific nauseating sensation of watching something private become public property. The article was thorough. Whoever wrote it had done real work. It covered the Reynolds Legacy Foundation, the extent of Claire's inherited holdings, the timeline of her decision to step back from her family's wealth and live quietly, and in a section toward the end that Daniel read 3 times, the fact that her ex-husband of approximately 2 months was a senior executive at the very company she now controlled. It didn't use Daniel's name in the headline. It used it in the 4th paragraph. By 9 a.m., his phone had received 47 calls and messages from numbers he recognized and numbers he didn't. By 10, the story had been picked up by 2 major national outlets. By noon, it was the kind of thing people were reading over lunch and forwarding to their contacts with the particular energy that attaches to stories that feel like parables. Daniel silenced his phone and sat in his apartment and stared at the wall. His mother called. He let it go to voicemail. She called again. He answered. Daniel. Her voice was careful, not angry. His mother, Barbara Whitmore, was 64 years old and had spent a lifetime saying hard things with a gentleness that somehow made them harder. "I just saw the news. I know. Are you all right?" He almost said yes, automatically, the reflexive social yes that people deploy to close the question quickly. But something stopped him. "No," he said, "I'm not really all right." A pause on the other end, long enough to tell him she was surprised. He answered honestly. "Tell me," she said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel Whitmore talked to his mother without managing what she thought of him. He told her about the divorce, about Madison, about the announcement, about the corridor conversation, about the meeting with Gerald and the 3 options sitting on his kitchen table in a folder he hadn't opened since he got home. His mother listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Daniel," she said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it, which is with love. Okay? Okay. When did you stop being curious about Claire?" He blinked. "What?" "When you 2 were first together, you used to call me and tell me about her. About conversations you'd had, things she'd said that surprised you. You were curious about her. You found her interesting." She paused. When did that stop? He didn't have an answer, because the honest answer was he didn't know. There was no specific day, no single decision. It had happened the way most slow losses happen, gradually, then completely, and by the time you notice it's gone, you can no longer point to the moment it left. "You stopped being curious," his mother said, "and you replaced it with certainty. You decided you knew who she was, and once you've decided that about a person, you stop seeing them." The line was quiet. "She saw you, though," Barbara said softly. "Even when you weren't worth seeing." He didn't trust his voice to respond to that. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. And for once, not knowing didn't feel like failure. It felt like the first honest position he had occupied in a very long time. The media coverage created a week of controlled chaos. Claire handled it the way she handled everything directly, without drama, with the kind of composed authority that made people around her calm down simply by proximity. She released a single statement through Apex Meridian's communications office. It was 4 sentences long. It confirmed her role, addressed the foundation's history with the company, noted that her personal history was her own, and closed with a line that became the sentence everyone quoted. The measure of any leader is not the circumstances they were born into, but the values they choose to operate by. She gave no interviews on the personal elements of the story. She did not address Daniel by name. She returned to work. Inside the company, the coverage had a strange clarifying effect. People who had been watching Claire for the past weeks with cautious interest became openly admiring. Not because she was wealthy, half the executive floor had been wealthy for years without earning anyone's respect for it, but because of the contrast. Because they had now seen the full picture of who she was and what she could have deployed at any moment. And they understood that the woman who sat in departmental meetings and asked genuine questions and wrote things down was choosing to be that person. She had always been choosing. The admiration, once it started, moved through the building like weather. And Daniel felt it like weather too, from the outside. He made his decision on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks after the meeting with Gerald, 11 days after the story broke, sitting alone at his kitchen table with the transition folder open in front of him. He was going to take the lateral reassignment, not because it was strategically optimal. Not because he had calculated that staying inside Apex Meridian gave him the best long-term position. He had tried to think about it that way and found he couldn't sustain the calculation. The old machinery that ran on pure strategic self-interest had seized up somewhere in the past 8 weeks, and he didn't know how to restart it. He was going to take the reassignment because the young analyst named Kevin still worked in this building, and the 14 people who had been in his division still worked here, and he had made a commitment small, uncelebrated, noticed by almost no one to be more present for the people who depended on him. And he intended to keep it. It was the smallest possible version of a better decision. But it was real, and real, he was learning, was the only currency that actually held its value. He signed the document and sent it to Gerald that night. Gerald's response arrived the next morning: received. We'll have the transition paperwork ready by end of week. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore, professional, clean. Exactly what Claire would have wanted. What happened next was the thing Daniel hadn't expected, and couldn't have planned for, and which turned out to matter more than any of the things he had spent 15 years planning. 6 weeks into his new role, Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships, smaller office, no longer on the executive floor, reporting to a division head who was 3 years younger than him and considerably less impressed by his history than the people who had known him before, Daniel was assigned to a cross-departmental project with a team he hadn't worked with before. The project was a partnerships initiative that Claire had prioritized in her first month, a series of agreements with smaller technology companies that the Reynolds Foundation had identified as undervalued and under-resourced, companies that needed institutional support rather than acquisition. The idea was to build relationships rather than simply buy assets. It was a different model than Apex Meridian had operated under for years. Daniel understood it immediately, not just intellectually but viscerally. Because the model was the same thing he had been learning, painfully and personally, to apply in his own life. The difference between owning something and investing in it. The difference between control and trust. He threw himself into the project with a focus that surprised everyone on the team, including himself. The project lead was a woman named Sanja Park, 34, forensically sharp, the kind of person who could absorb a 50-page financial document in 20 minutes and come out with 3 questions nobody else had thought to ask. She had no history with Daniel, no opinion of him derived from his old title or his former reputation. She simply watched what he did on the project and formed her view from there. 3 weeks in, she stopped him in the corridor after a team meeting. "You're different from what I expected," she said. He looked at her. What did you expect? The stories about you from the executive floor. Before she shrugged, not unkindly. I expected someone who was good at politics and bad at actual work. And you're actually good at the work, she said. I thought you should know someone noticed. He thanked her. He meant it. He went back to his desk and sat down and opened the project files and kept working, and something in his chest that had been compressed for months loosened another degree. It was not redemption. He was not naive enough to call it that, and he was done performing emotions he didn't actually feel. It was simpler than redemption. It was just the daily, unglamorous work of being better at something than he had been before, not for an audience, not for a career, not for any outcome he could already see. Just because it was the right direction. The moment that broke everything open came on a Thursday afternoon, 67 days after the auditorium announcement. Daniel was in a working session with Sanja's team when his phone buzzed with a calendar notification he had completely forgotten about. He looked at it and felt his chest constrict. It was the anniversary of the day he and Claire had gotten engaged. He had put it in his phone years ago as a recurring reminder and had never deleted it. And so here it was, arriving on schedule in the middle of a working Thursday, reminding him of a moment on a park bench in October 9 years ago when a version of himself had been brave enough to ask, and Claire had looked at him with the full, unguarded warmth of someone who believed completely in what she was saying when she said yes. He put the phone face down on the table. He kept working. But that evening when he got home, he sat down and wrote Claire an email. Not to get something, not to reopen a door, not because he had calculated any benefit to sending it. He wrote it because he had something to say that he hadn't said yet, and he was tired of carrying it. It took him 45 minutes to write 4 paragraphs. He wrote about the engagement anniversary. He wrote about what he remembered from that day, not sentimentally but accurately. He wrote that he understood now what he had been too blind to see during their marriage, that she had spent 8 years giving him something genuine, and he had spent those same years treating her generosity as a given rather than a gift. He wrote that he was not asking for anything, not forgiveness, not a conversation, not a changed outcome. He just wanted her to know that he finally saw it clearly, that the loss was real and that he understood it was his fault, and that she deserved to hear that from him without any asterisks. He read it back twice, then he sent it before he could perform himself out of it. He closed the laptop and went to bed and didn't sleep well, but he slept with a clear conscience for the first time in as long as he could remember. Claire's response arrived at 6:42 the next morning. It was 3 sentences. Thank you for this, Daniel. I believe you mean it, and that matters. Take good care of yourself. He read it at his kitchen table with his morning coffee, and he read it several times. And he held it with the care of someone who understands they are holding something that is both a closing and a beginning. A closing of the story that had run between them for 9 years. The one that had started with genuine warmth and been corroded slowly by pride and ambition and the particular blindness of a man who confused success with worth. And a beginning quiet, unspectacular, uncertain of the story of who Daniel Whitmore might become when he stopped performing and started paying attention. He folded the email away in his mind the way you fold something you will keep but not display. And he got ready for work, because that was the other thing he was learning, slowly and without fanfare, in the wreckage of everything he had been so certain of. That life does not wait for you to finish processing your failures before it asks you to show up. It keeps moving, it keeps asking. And the question it asks every single morning, without sentiment or ceremony, is simply this: who are you going to be today? He had spent 36 years answering that question with his ambitions, with his title, with his calculation of what the people around him could offer him and what they couldn't. He was learning at considerable cost to answer it differently. The man who had laughed while signing divorce papers was still there in his memory, vivid and shameful and completely real. He couldn't edit that man out of his history. He couldn't pretend the laughter hadn't happened, or that the cruelty behind it was anything other than what it was. But he could choose what came next, and every morning, for the first time in a very long time, that choice felt like his own. Not a performance, not a calculation, not a move in a game he had convinced himself he was winning. Just a choice, made by a man who was finally, honestly, beginning to understand the difference between knowing your own worth and knowing your own self. Those are not the same thing. He was learning that the hard way. The only way it ever really gets learned. 4 months after the auditorium announcement, Apex Meridian was a different company. Not dramatically different. Not in the headline-grabbing way that corporate transformations usually announce themselves. It was different in the way that a room feels different after someone opens a window, the same furniture, the same walls, but the air itself has changed. People noticed it in small ways first, in the way meetings ran differently, in the way decisions got made, in the way the people at the top of the organization treated the people at the bottom. Claire had not arrived with a revolution, she had arrived with a standard. And standards, applied consistently and without favoritism, have a way of reshaping everything around them. She had made 3 significant personal decisions in her first month that sent a message through every level of the company more clearly than any memo could have. She promoted a mid-level project manager named Rosa Delgado, who had been passed over for advancement twice in 3 years, despite performance reviews that were objectively exceptional. When people asked why Rosa had been passed over before, the honest answer was that she wasn't the type who networked aggressively or made herself visible to leadership. She just did her work, brilliantly, quietly, and it had cost her. Claire found her through the file review she conducted, in her first 2 weeks reading personnel, restructured the way she read everything, thoroughly and without shortcuts, and promoted her to Director of Operations. The second decision was the departure of a senior vice president in the marketing division named Craig Ellison. Craig had been at Apex Meridian for 11 years and had a reputation for delivering results that was matched only by his reputation for making the people under him miserable. Complaints had been filed, multiple times. Each time his performance numbers had been sufficient justification to let them slide. Not anymore. Claire called Craig into her office, personally. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. Craig left Apex Meridian that same afternoon with a negotiated exit package and an NDA, and he was replaced within the week by a woman who had been his deputy for 4 years and had been quietly carrying the division's actual operational intelligence while Craig took the credit. The third decision was smaller in scale but larger in symbolic weight. She instituted a quarterly open forum mandatory for all executive and senior staff, open to any employee who wanted to attend, where leadership answered unscreened questions from the floor. No pre-submitted talking points, no filtered audience. Just questions asked by real people answered in real time. The first one was standing room only. The second one required them to move to the auditorium. People inside the company talked about these decisions with the particular energy of people who have been waiting for something without quite knowing they were waiting. And the word that came up again and again in conversations over lunch and emails between departments and quiet exchanges at the end of long meetings was the same word. Real, she's real. It seemed like a simple thing to say about a leader. It turned out to be the rarest. Daniel heard these conversations from his new position, close enough to the center of the company to understand what was happening, far enough from it to observe without the distortion of being inside it. And what he observed over those 4 months was the specific education of watching someone lead from a set of values rather than a set of strategies. He had always thought of values as the soft language that people use to dress up strategies. The PR layer over the real decisions, he had been wrong. He was learning, watching Claire, that values were the infrastructure. The strategy ran on top, and when the values were solid, the strategy held weight. When they were hollow, everything eventually collapsed. He had built his career on strategy alone. He understood now why it had felt at the end of all of it like standing on something that couldn't hold him. It was a Thursday morning in late February when Sonja Park knocked on his office door and changed the direction of the next chapter of his life. "You have 10 minutes, she asked. "Always," he said. She sat down across from him and put a folder on the desk between them. The Reynolds Foundation Partnerships Initiative. We've been running it for 3 months now. The preliminary numbers came in this morning. He opened the folder. He scanned the figures. He looked up. These are strong, he said. They're more than strong, Sonia said. The ROI on the first 4 partnership agreements is running 31% ahead of initial projections. And that's before 2 of the partners have fully activated their technology integrations. She paused. Claire's office has been briefed. Gerald Whitfield called me this morning. They want a full presentation at the next board meeting. That's great, Daniel said. Your team deserves it. This was your execution. Sonia looked at him with the particular expression she used when she was being precise. It was a team effort, Daniel, and you need to be in that room. The model you developed for the partnership evaluation framework, that's what made the selection process work. Gerald specifically asked if you'd be presenting. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Gerald asked for me specifically? He said, and I'm quoting directly, "Please ensure, Mr. Whitmore is part of the presentation team." Something moved through Daniel that he didn't immediately have a name for. It wasn't vindication, it was too quiet for that. Too complicated. It was more like the feeling of being seen accurately by someone who has reason to see you critically, and choosing to report what they actually found rather than what would be easier. I'll be there, he said. The board meeting was on a Monday. Daniel spent the weekend preparing with the kind of focus he hadn't brought to work in years, not the performance preparation of a man trying to impress a room, but the genuine preparation of someone who cares about getting the details right because the details matter. He was at the office by 7:30. The board meeting started at 10. At 9:45, he was standing in the corridor outside the boardroom with Sonia and 2 other members of the team, reviewing the last points of the presentation when the elevator opened and Claire stepped out. She was alone. She walked toward the boardroom room with the measured pace of someone who is never actually rushing because they are never actually late. She had a leather portfolio under one arm and her phone in her hand, and she was reading something on the screen. She looked up when she reached the group. She greeted Sonia by name. She greeted the 2 junior team members by name. Then she looked at Daniel. Daniel, she said, same, not cold, not warm. Professional and honest, Claire, he said. She glanced at the folder in his hands. The evaluation framework. Gerald tells me it's what drove the partner selection. It was a team effort, he said, which was true, and which was also the first time in his professional life he had said that sentence without mentally appending a list of qualifications about his own specific contribution. Something almost imperceptible crossed Claire's face. If you had been watching carefully enough, you might have called it acknowledgement. Good work, she said simply. She walked into the boardroom. Daniel stood in the corridor for a half-second longer than was necessary. Then he followed. The presentation lasted 40 minutes. The board asked 15 questions. Daniel answered 7 of them. He answered them clearly, without embellishment, without the self-promotional layer he used to apply to everything he said in high-stakes rooms. He answered them because he knew the material, and knowing the material was enough. When it was over, the board chair, a woman in her 70s named Patricia Aldridge, who had been on the Reynolds Foundation's board since Claire's parents were alive, looked across the table and said, "This is exactly the direction the foundation visioned when it committed to this strategy. Well done to the whole team." She looked at Daniel briefly when she said whole team. He accepted it without deflecting it. After the room cleared, Gerald found him in the corridor. "A moment," Gerald said. They walked to a small sitting area near the elevators. Gerald sat. Daniel sat. "I'll be direct," Gerald said. "The chairwoman has asked me to convey something to you, and I want to make sure I do it accurately." He folded his hands on his knee. "She is aware of the work you've put into the Partnerships Initiative. She is aware of the changes in how you have been operating within your team. She wanted you to know that it has been noted, not for the purpose of any immediate personnel decision. Simply noted. Daniel looked at him. She asked you to tell me that? She did. He sat with that for a moment. Why? He asked. Why does she want me to know? Gerald considered the question with the care he brought to everything. Because she is the kind of person who believes in telling the truth about people, he said. In both directions. When something is wrong, she says so. When something is right, she says that too. He paused. She is not managing your perception of her. She is simply being accurate. Daniel nodded slowly. Gerald. He paused. You told me in our first meeting that she talked about wanting things to be real. That was what mattered to her, yes. Is she? He stopped. Reorganized. Is she okay? Not professionally, just. As a person, is she okay? Gerald looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that contains a complete assessment. Yes, he said, she is more than okay. She is, in my experience of knowing her for most of her life, the most fully herself she has ever been. Daniel absorbed that. That's good, he said, and he meant it cleanly. Without grief, without resentment, without the complicated undertow of wanting something from the answer. Just, that's good, Gerald studied. Yes, he said. It is. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived not from inside Apex Meridian but from outside it, and it arrived in the form of a woman named Sandra Cho. Sandra Cho was a financial journalist with a national publication that had been covering the Reynolds Foundation story since it broke in February. She had published 3 pieces already thorough, well-researched, careful in the way that real financial journalism is careful. In April, she published a 4th piece that was different from the others. This one was not about Apex Meridian's performance or the Reynolds Foundation's holdings or Claire's leadership decisions. This one was about the years before. Sandra had done what very few people had managed to do. She had traced the full arc of Claire's quiet years. The nonprofit work. The graduate courses taken under her own name with no connection to the Reynolds identity. The deliberate years-long project of building a life that was entirely her own. And Sandra had interviewed, with Claire's permission, 3 people from those years, a former co-worker from the nonprofit, a professor from Columbia, a neighbor from the small apartment Claire had lived in, before she met Daniel, who described a woman of exceptional intelligence and complete unpretentiousness who had given no indication ever of what she came from. The article's headline was, "She chose to be nobody." Then she chose to be herself. It ran on a Wednesday morning, and by Thursday it had been shared more than 300,000 times. Daniel read it at his desk. He read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He had always thought in the years of their marriage, when he had thought about it at all, that Claire's simple lifestyle was the product of limited imagination. That she lived quietly because she didn't dream of anything larger. That her contentment was passivity with a pleasant face. The article made devastatingly clear what he should have understood from the first conversation he'd ever had with her. Claire's simplicity was not absence of vision, it was the most sophisticated possible exercise of it. She had seen, with total clarity, what money did to relationships, and she had chosen, deliberately and at real personal cost, to remove it from the equation. To find out what remained for 8 years had been Daniel. And Daniel had not been enough. Not because he lacked potential. The article said nothing about Daniel directly, but he felt its implications with every paragraph. He had not been enough because he had been looking in the wrong direction the entire time. Toward status, toward advancement, toward the reflection of himself in other people's eyes. Never inward, never at the quiet, extraordinary person sitting across from him who had been conducting the most private, most principled experiment of her life right beside him. He closed the article. He picked up his phone and called his mother. "I read the piece," Barbara said before he could speak. "Yeah, oh Daniel," her voice was soft, not pitying. "Just honest, I know," he said. "She let that journalist interview people who knew her," Barbara said. "She didn't have to do that. She could have kept all of it private." "I know, why do you think she did it?" He thought about that. He thought about Claire's 3-sentence email. about the way she looked at people when they spoke to her, about the open forums and the personnel decisions and the partnerships initiative and every small, consistent choice she had made since walking onto that stage. Because she wants people to understand something, he said slowly. Not about herself, about the choice, about what it costs and what it's worth to live by what you actually believe. Barbara was quiet for a moment. She's teaching, Barbara said softly. Yeah, Daniel said, she always was. The moment that completed Daniel's transformation, the one that had no audience and significance to anyone except him, happened on a Saturday morning in early May. He had volunteered to mentor a young man named James through a professional development program that Apex Meridian had expanded under Claire's leadership. James was 26, first-generation college graduate, brilliant and hungry, and carrying the specific anxiety of someone who has worked extremely hard to get somewhere and is terrified of making the wrong move now that they're there. They met at a coffee shop near the office. James had a list of questions prepared, careful, specific, the questions of someone who had done their research and taken the meeting seriously. They talked for 2 hours. At the end, James looked at his notes and then looked up. Can I ask you something off the script, he said. Always, Daniel said. People say you used to be different. Before the restructuring, before everything with the chairwoman, he was careful with his words. Respectful, but direct. I just want to know, how do you change, like genuinely change? Not just change your behavior because something forced you to, but actually change who you are inside. Daniel looked at this young man, 26 years old, asking the question that Daniel had spent the last 5 months living the answer to. You have to get honest about what you've been wrong about, Daniel said. Not in a vague way. Specifically, you have to be able to name the exact things you got wrong and say them out loud without qualifying them. Without adding butter to be fair or given the circumstances. James nodded slowly, and then he asked, and then you have to do different things. Small things, every day, without anyone watching and without waiting to feel like a different person first. You don't feel different and then change. You change and then slowly you start feeling different. He paused. It takes longer than you think, and it's less dramatic than you want it to be. There's no moment where you wake up fixed, there's just Tuesday. And then Wednesday, and you trying to be better on Wednesday than you were on Tuesday. James wrote that down. Daniel watched him write it and felt, with a clarity that needed no qualification, that this conversation, this small, unscheduled, unphotographed exchange in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning was the most valuable professional thing he had done in years. 6 months after the auditorium announcement, Apex Meridian published its first report under Claire's leadership. The numbers were strong, stronger than projected. The Partnerships Initiative was highlighted as a significant driver of new value. Daniel's name appeared in the acknowledgments section, not prominently, not in a way that would have satisfied the version of him that used to count mentions and track visibility. Just accurately, one name among several, his portion of the work represented faithfully. He read it and felt nothing but satisfaction, clean, uncomplicated, genuine satisfaction. The kind that doesn't need an audience. It was Gerald who arranged the final meeting, though he would never have called it that. He sent a simple calendar invitation in late May coffee, informal, the Reynolds Foundation offices, and when Daniel arrived, he found Gerald alone. They talked for 30 minutes about the company, about the partnerships program, about a new initiative Claire was developing that Gerald thought Daniel was well positioned to contribute to. It was a genuine professional conversation, and Daniel engaged with it as one. At the end, as they were standing to leave, Gerald said something that Daniel would carry with him for the rest of his life. She asked about you, last week. She asked how you were doing. Not the professional version, the actual version. Daniel was very still. What did you tell her? I told her the truth, Gerald said. I told her you were becoming someone worth knowing. Daniel looked at him, and what did she say? Gerald smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile Daniel had ever seen from him. She said, I always thought he could be. He walked out of the Reynolds Foundation offices into the late afternoon of a New York spring day and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, and the city moved around him the way it always does, indifferent and relentless and full of people in the middle of their own stories. And he thought about a woman who had loved him before he was worth loving, who had stayed while he became someone lesser, who had left not with bitterness but with clarity, who had built something extraordinary in the space he had vacated, and who had found it in herself, even after everything, to say she always thought he could be better. He did not call her, he did not send another email, he did not try to reopen what was fully properly closed. Because that was the final thing he had learned. That love, real love, the kind Claire had offered him for 8 years, and he had never fully received because he was always looking past it at something. Shinier does not demand its own continuation. It doesn't require you to come back to it. It simply asks that you carry what it taught you forward into every room you enter, every person you encounter, every moment where you have the choice between seeing someone clearly and looking through them. Claire had loved him that way. He intended from here forward to live in a way that was worthy of having been loved like that. Even if she never knew it, even if no one ever knew it. Because the man Daniel Whitmore was becoming had finally learned the one thing the man Daniel Whitmore used to be had never understood, that who you are when no one is watching is not the secondary version of yourself. It is the only version that is real, and real in the end is the only thing worth being.